Dear friends, this is the European Chamber birthday party. We have a history of 20 years, so we are young, energetic, and sometimes a bit foolish. And we're very happy that you can join us for this round with friends. This is the start of a 8-event series. I'm very privileged to convince my old friends to step up to the plate and actually help us in order to look at China from different kinds of angles. And I'm very privileged that we start today with close friends, one in Berlin, that's Mikko Huotari. He's the executive director of MERIX, which I think can really be labeled as the best think tank in Europe on China. And then my old friend, Professor Zhang. Jian is professor of political science and assistant dean at the School of Government at Beijing University. He's dialing in from Italy. So we have two Europe-based analysts now looking at the Chinese politics. We have about 90 minutes, and I will basically lead into this discussion and trying to provoke my friends and then see how this goes. And you are encouraged to send in questions. Jacob from the Chamber, our lead pen, is taking note, and he will then at one stage interrupt us and start going through your questions and answer our panelists. So prepare yourself and bombard Jacob. So I basically would like to start with the National People's Congress. As it's now fixed for the 22nd of May, and which is very unusual. I mean, after 30 years in China, I've never seen an NPC so late. Certainly, COVID had something to do with this. So maybe I'll start with Jian, and then Mikko can follow up. Is this, why was it so late? Because it looked pretty, safe over here. Second, the NPC, will it be a real NPC? Will it be, like us today, a virtual NPC? And what is your anticipation, what they will discuss, and what will come out of it? So Jian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here with Jörg and with Mikko Huotari. It's my honor to be here, I'm very glad. I think I should speak on your second question first. That is, will this be a real NPC? Of course, it's going to be real in terms of its the authority. Everything passed over there will become law and a formal government policy, but it's not real because, as far as I know, there's a report since today say that the session will be cut shorter, much shorter. In the last, I would say, almost 20 years. The regular annual NPC will last about 11, 12 days, but this time it's going to be only 7 calendar days. It's much shorter, and I learned it's not going to be virtual. It's still going to be held in the People's Conference Hall, and I mean, if it's a virtual, actually, the delegations from various governments not to fly to Beijing. We got a report actually today. We are going to be flying into Beijing and check in Beijing local hotels and have the conference in People's Conference Hall. So it's going to be real, shorter. But to your question about why this is, I would say, so late, and obviously, the COVID-19 is a factor. Regularly the People's Congress would be held in the first week, regular Monday of started from the first Monday or say Friday of March. But we remember that in March the outbreak was still very, very serious across the country. So it was not really safe at that time. I think that explains quite a lot about the postponement of the NPC. And somebody would say Beijing is already safe, maybe as early as in April. So why it's still maybe too late? Even we take into consideration of the COVID-19, maybe May the 22nd is too late. I don't really know about that. I think, in the first month during the heyday of the outbreak, people don't, top leaders don't really have time to really schedule the NPC. It's only when they can be sure that the NPC would be, the situation in Beijing would be good enough, then can they really, schedule the NPC. So in that sense, I would say May the 22nd is not that outrageous. Yeah.
Yeah, Jian, thank you. It's your voice is coming and going. I hope that is that's only here at the receiving end. But thank you very much. For Mikko also, why the NPC so late? The stories we hear in Beijing is a little bit that they were really not sure where the economy is heading after the supply shock and then a possible demand shock, the trade problems and so forth. So some say that the May 22nd is because it's very much into the year already and they have a better understanding of where the economy is going, because NPC, after all, is decision-making on the economy down to the provinces. But Mikko, your take.
Right. First of all, thank you, Jörg. Thanks for the invitation. And also, I think we should all say congratulations to 45 years of EU-China relations. So 75, 6th of May. So we have a good date today. That's your incredible wisdom, as always, to do things like that. On the NPC, if you can open the Disneyland, you can also hold the NPC. Maybe that's the right way to put it. It will be a mix of two things. First, it's the incredible sensitivity and the risk assessment for Beijing. Health alerts, much better, are just down recently, and kids back in school, etc. So the more important is probably the calculation about understanding what's actually happening, getting a better understanding of the global fallout of the crisis, and the mix of that then results in a date that is late. I think on the details of how it will be held, other rumors that I've heard is that group meetings will be different as before, but obviously we now know that it will be a real meeting indeed. So 10 weeks later, indeed, historically unusual, but under the given constellation, it's quite normal still to accept that this delay, I think.
So what will they talk about? What will be the major decisions to come out of the NPC this year?
Right. Everyone will be looking for pointers for post-COVID China. Clear indications for how the stimulus will be calibrated, etc., will be required to understand how troubled the leadership really sees the economy. And there's this talk about shifting the use of the growth target. That's one thing that we will be watching quite carefully. And quite honestly, again, I don't think anyone knows whether it will be a lower, a higher, or a mix of targets and maybe just no target or a new set of targets, which I personally think is the most likely. That will also look at factors such as employment, etc. I think in practical policy terms, you will see a lot on SME support, on small, medium enterprises, a lot on new infrastructure, 5G rollout, etc., on poverty alleviation. And then, a continuation of that attempt to smooth the stimulus in a way that maintains a balance between the structural reform agenda and the overall stress in the system. Yeah. So what I fear is really that, the main focus will be really on the 6 guarantees, ensures language and mentality, which is really risk management first. So the Liu Bao, not stability, but really resilience, survival of the system. And so this is about employment, company survival, food and energy security, supply chains, government operations. So a lot on just getting things done in this really complicated situation, and probably not a lot of long-term clarity about the reform agenda. That's my take. Would be surprised if anything more optimistic and more forward-leaning would happen at the NPC these days.
So Jian, will it be the point where they will admit that 5-6% is impossible, and sort of the dream of doubling whatever the GDP per capita is not possible. And of course, the other question I would have for you is, will people talk about the decision-making process that actually got us here in the mess, meaning what can be done better in order to make the Chinese system more resilient when it comes to pandemics?
Okay, I think I agree with what Mikko just said, and in terms of the specific target number, 5% or 6% for the next year, I think the government would show a lot more flexibility this year. I think Mikko already showed, already the tip, something like that. Some of the previous, I mean, conferences in. So I don't think they have a very clear, very rigid target number. And in terms, but I want to add that other than this specific policy output that we are expecting from the NPC, from my point of view, and this is somehow linked to your second question about decision making, I think the NPC would first of all, because NPC is not really the decision-making body in China, right? It's just a rubber stamp. The real decision has already been made in the State Council, or very much, say, in the party center, various, small groups or commissions, comprehensive reform, things like this. So NPC, in my point of view, would also, of course, we're going to get, those specific policy stamped with authenticity or authority from the NPC. That's important. But I think more importantly, NPC would serve as a big celebration of the fight against the COVID-19 in China. I think that's the real, I would say, purpose or real mission of the NPC for this year, for this year. Other than that, it's going to do a lot of a regular, a rubber stamp job. It's not really that important. So it's going to be a big celebration. We won, the war against the COVID-19. And actually that is already answered partially to Jörg's question about, say, is there any going to something about the decision-making process, blah, blah, blah. I do not think so. There may be reform about the specific, I would say, bureaucratic structure of the say system of the Chinese CDC, Medicare, Ministry of Public. There may be discussion or even measures at this level, but in terms of decision making, what is the decision-making process in China in the last few years? There's one-man decision-making, basically, right? Especially for very, very important things like, say, lock down a huge city of 15 million people, or lock down the whole country. I mean, only one man can do this kind of decision and can make this kind of decision. And I don't think that will be a serious challenge to that decision model, the real decision model in China.
I agree with you, Jian, and I think just one thing to add potentially is that the whole issue of biosecurity will probably feature somewhere, and with a new law potentially coming out, and that will relate to what you just said, re-embedding the CDC and any prevention bodies and health institutions in a new setup that we don't really know how it would look like, but that's a plausible outcome that the NPC will prepare for that. But as you just said, I mean, eventually this is about party control and party governance much more than state governance in many regards.
Yeah. I mean, possibly as so many bigwigs are going to assemble here in Beijing, will there be some discussions also going on propaganda? I mean, 30 years in China, I've never seen this kind of crude and robust propaganda coming up. I think the toolbox has been shrinking possibly, and that's why the sword and the hammer seems to be the instruments these days. So is there going to be discussion on how much China loses in soft power influence globally if it continues to go down the road? I mean, the wolf warrior now is a word that the whole world has understood what it stands for. Isn't it a time now for a setting like this to reconsider, guys, possibly we have overdone the show?
Well, unfortunately, I think these debates will happen very much behind the scenes, if at all, and in many ways, only pretty high level and protected figures can come out with statements that point to a different take on things. So you had Jian recently from the consultative conference coming out with, a narrative that said, look, we should be using this opportunity to spread Chinese aid. So not a promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not a promotion of, wolf warrior diplomacy, but a more down-to-earth approach and policy proposal. And, figures like him and others might be able to promote other policy ideas, but pushing back in a semi-public way on propaganda, external propaganda, and the overall diplomacy approach, I don't think that anyone can afford doing that currently in the system. Yes, behind the doors, certainly. I mean, as you've seen already with, the more decent statements by the Chinese ambassador in the US when he said, well, that's not an issue for diplomats, referring to the wolf warrior statements, etc. That's the maximum we can expect, probably.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think because I'm a citizen of China, being somehow represented by those wolf warriors or wolves, so I don't know I think they are not a representative of my opinion for whatever amount. And I would say the wolf warrior, actually, I think I said this before in some other occasions with Jürgen. I mean, they are not new. They are suddenly gained more wide, I would say, visibility during the COVID-19. But I mean, the ambassador in London and some of the other smaller figure diplomats in other parts of the world, they have been engaging this kind of warrior-like language for quite a few years. Read some of the publications of Ambassador Liu Xiaoming in Financial Times or other British publications. I mean, the culture has been there. I would say that this is I would say a trend started, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, among the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Suddenly you got this kind of, say, much more assertive diplomats, which is so assertive to the level of undiplomatic. This is something new. And Mikko mentioned Jia Qingguo, he was my professor when I was undergrad in that college. So, I mean, the Chinese, Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually, generally speaking, in the last 30, 40 years, underwent some very good, I would say, professionalization trajectory. They're better educated, better trained, speak better language of the local country. That's great. But then I would say some big politics that are beyond the control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs happened. So you got this group of warriors over there. So I think the warrior actually stand for some big macro political change in this country. And as long as that is not changed or that is not questioned or challenged, we're not going to see some major, say, change of tone among those, most famous warrior diplomats in China.
Yeah, I mean, you have possibly generational change. I remember very well the former Chinese ambassador to France, who was fluent in French, unfortunately got killed in a car crash 7, 8 years ago in Wuhan, of all places, how he was lamenting publicly about the quality of diplomacy going down already 7, 8 years ago. And the man was just incredibly engaging. He was soft power on legs. So it's really a pity to see that, again, I mean, you have the old school like Cui, you have also, lucky for us, Ambassador Zhang in Brussels, who's old school and a very subtle diplomat. But again, I mean, it's concerning to see that you do possibly have a better career if you bark and bite. So talking about the more aggressive stance, I mean, let's cross the Atlantic from your point of view. And look at the US. I mean, the US is equally firing from every corner with all kinds of accusations. The best and the most recent one is the laboratory story, where I must say personally, talking to my friends in intelligence services, none of them believes that there's any truth to it. So these accusations from Pompeo, will they stick with the public? And will they stick with the public in Europe also?
Jian, you want to go first? I'm happy to
go first. I got some new coffee for me.
Good,
yeah.
that's good. Yeah. And so obviously there's a clear risk that this type of narrative sticks in the US public, simply because of the way how the media works there, and the fact that we are in full out campaign mode these days. I don't think there is any chance really that this is something that is politically important in Europe, really. There might be fringe groups and some actors who jump on this bandwagon, but I don't think we can really afford, as European politicians can't afford to play with that, because it's so unfounded. And as you said, even Five Eyes intelligence is pushing back against it. So it would be politically insensible to do that. At the same time, and you've heard the European Commission President already saying that, there's support for a more neutral idea to investigate what has happened throughout this crisis. And implicitly, or sometimes more explicitly, that includes obviously, that we need to know what happened at the outset of this crisis. So there's support in European circles on this idea, which is somewhat a bridge building attempt between the hard push from Washington to triple down on this, story that, China is the bad guy here. And to some extent, we should be very much interested in understanding to what extent that's true. But Europe is trying to build a bridge, looking at a more neutral, science-based understanding of what really has happened. And with that, to some extent, also giving China a way out if they wanted to follow up with this. That's a smart move by Europe, I think. Unlikely, unfortunately, probably that there will be a follow-up to this.
What do you, Mikko, what do you make of this recent articles by one of our most influential newspapers in Germany, Bild and Welt am Sonntag, where the heads of these companies go public and accuse Xi Jinping personally, and the head of the whole company, the CEO, Döpfner, basically said we have to choose between the US and China. So what do you make of this? Is this also something that resonates in Italy, where you are right now, Jian, that people think like they have to choose at one stage between the US and China?
Okay. Yeah, I think, European countries, especially business of European countries, are still having a huge ambivalence toward choosing sides. I heard more than one say, my local friends here in Italy and some of the French said, we don't want to choose sides. I think especially the business community do not want to choose the sides, but that's just my personal impression. But I think what I really want to assert, this is a discussion, so I want to make some bolder statement than I would regularly make, is that maybe there will be in the near future a moment that Europe has to choose sides. It's quite unavoidable, because in the big triangle, very sadly, in the big triangle, if the other angle, Washington and Beijing really goes to fierce competition or rivalry, or somebody call it a new Cold War like situation, as Washington and Beijing is, likely to go down the channel. I think Europe has to choose. There's no way that Europe can ignore its, say, transatlantic alliance with Washington, There's no way that Europe is going to ignore the very fact that, US dollars is still the currency of global business. There's no way for Europe to really ignore the fact that fundamentally there's more cultural and value similarity between European Union and I would say the Anglo-American countries instead of that China. I think there would be that kind of choice, moment of choice approaching us very, very quickly. Only when you see Washington and Beijing normalize or tone down their relation, then I would say Europe would avoid that very, very difficult choice. I don't see that's happening. I mean, we started, this short conversation by Pompeo's, accusation of Wuhan lab and everything like that. Of course, scientifically, that is a very, the value of that is an issue. But I think Pompeo is also, like the warrior diplomats of China, Pompeo is also, I would say, a representative or an expression of the already changed political culture, or I would say strategic stance in Washington, D.C. I don't think, I see only the COVID-19 only strengthening or deepening that change, or further put the two, make the Pacific Ocean wider. If the Pacific Ocean is making wider and wider, it has to be the case that Atlantic Ocean is going to get narrower and narrower. That's my theory.
Mikko, as European German with Finnish background and heritage, what do you think will Europe do?
Well, first of all, I like the geographical insight here about shifting continent plates. But anyway, and basically, to a large extent, in agreement with Jian, in the sense that I think there's a very limited window of opportunity for Europeans and the German presidency as it comes up. To actually shape this space. We are in a US-China maelstrom, and things are happening on a day-to-day basis. There's very few indications that the trajectory will fundamentally change in any sense of strategic competition, and now really moving in sometimes all-out hostility already. And next 6 months will be crazy because of the campaign, and then there's a pretty solid risk that it's going to be another 4 years of Trump. And even as we all know, under Biden, the structural trend will not be fundamentally different. What will be different, what would be different, as everyone knows, is our relationship with the US under Biden. And that is a critical factor, clearly. And you pointed to Döpfner's pieces in the Welt. And I think the real takeaway from this is China is now domestic politics, and that there is this strategic dilemma for Europe. And that's obviously well established now, and politicians will ride on it. My expectation is that also for the new government coming in next year in Germany, this will be something that for the first time in the history of Germany, the China relationship, some will campaign on. So we basically now have a situation where what's happening for years already in South Korea, in Malaysia, and Indonesia, and in the Philippines, that the China relationship is a core domestic politics factor. And that's, we're not prepared for that, quite honestly. Yeah. In terms of the actual narrative that Döpfner is spinning, I don't think it's well thought out, because eventually what he says is, look, we have to choose, our choice needs to be the US. And then he says, well, we should be joining the US in terms of pushing forward for decoupling. But on the exact what the decoupling should be, he's totally blank. And I think we're more ahead on this. I fundamentally think that we have already made our choice to some extent. And that, as you said, Jian, I mean, normatively and most importantly in terms of our security relationship, for the foreseeable future, we're incredibly bound to Washington, and this will continue. So what it will create is a situation where we will have costs in our transatlantic relationship and massive costs in our China relationship. Not necessarily a good outcome, obviously, for us, but I don't think that this is a real question about our choice. In many regards, we've done this choice already. and we just prepare for the costs that this choice will have in the near future. So maybe we need a shift of a mindset here. We want to maintain, obviously, a lot of our relationship with China, and rightly so. But the reality is there will be massive costs of that going ahead.
Yeah. A friend of mine actually works in the White House, and he said to me that a document drew the attention of Donald Trump, and he normally never really reads a lot of documents. He was absolutely mesmerized by the recent Pew poll that showed that the support in the US for China is eroding very rapidly. You know that Brett Parscale, the digital media director of Donald Trump, who is running the campaign 2020 for Trump, is a very savvy person who has basically led Trump to the success in 2016. Now, Trump was reading apparently the whole report cover to cover, which is a rare achievement on his side. So in a way, the worry that many people have is, will there be a dedicated negative China bashing season, the silly season, as they say in the US, what will be then the European position on this one? Or Jian, if you can say, well, how will China react to the silly season when they are getting whacked around until November?
What until November?
I mean, the election? How will China react to the fact that they're in the silly season of the election, in the campaign? There will be a very strong anti-China theme, also in order to put Biden, who they now label as Beijing Biden, into the defensive.
Well, I think China cares most about the election, the coming election in the United States. But I don't say China has a lot of tools in their arsenal to really dealing with this kind of China bashing themed election, this year. And I mean, the poster of China has been, I would say, hardened in the last few years to such a degree that there's a very small likelihood that China could back off, from a confrontation with the United States, even with, Trump. And if I would say China showed any, sign of softening in front, especially in front of, kind of Trump-like language, because Trump said something horrible, or Pompeo said something horrible, so China softened some of the stuff. That kind of a political, cost is really unaffordable for Chinese politicians. So I see more than any other scenario that the escalation of the exchange of very bad language or even policies would happen. I mean, what if, by September or October, the U.S. top universities are suddenly going to ban Chinese visitor or Chinese students in even more, departments. If that kind of a measure are taken, I don't think that China has any way to step back.
I do fully agree, unfortunately, and what we see in the US now, 66%, I think so, 2/3 of this poll basically being willing and ready in terms of mentality to serve on that anti-China campaign, which we will see. I don't think there's any good reason to expect that it will not happen. It's probably one of the last way outs for Trump to save his presidency, because economically, there's massive shocks coming ahead, and domestically, pushback from states, etc., will increase. So on the US side, I'm pretty pessimist. On the China side, to some extent, if you look at the overall strategic picture too, I mean, if at all we've seen tactical softening of specific stances vis-a-vis the US, the trade, first phase deal, etc. But structurally, the system is increasingly prepared for conflict, and they're doing everything to again build up resilience, etc. So it would it would require a massive shock domestically, economically, first of all, in China to lead to a rethinking of what is currently, I think, the basic parameters of their strategic setup, which is to prepare for that confrontation as it is coming. At least if you sit in Beijing at where the levels of power actually happen. So unfortunately, I think not betting on a economic crisis in China, which we all don't want to see. This conflict is pretty much in a spiral mode these days, and we better prepare for it.
I got only one thing to add on this, very short, is that not only say the image of China is deteriorating among the U.S. publics, I would say the same thing happening among the Chinese public. You know, the anti-American or anti-West sentiment is vigilantly high in China. I would say maybe the all-time highest point in the last 40 years or even 50 years. You know, ever since Nixon visited China, right? It's really, really unimaginable for us to see that you know, China is going to step back. Yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah, Jian, you possibly have seen my old friend Matt Pottinger with his beautiful Chinese speaking yesterday.
Maybe he was a Wall Street journalist, you know, at that time. You know, I met quite a lot of say U.S. journalists during his stay. I couldn't say that I still remember him, but there must be some, you know, occasion that you know, the two of us met. Yeah.
I mean, Matt was here in the 20 years ago. He covered SARS in 2003 very well. He knows China inside out. And yesterday, he gave, for the audience, he gave a speech in beautiful Chinese about May 4th. It was actually 2 days ago. Very fitting. How does that resonate with those people who can circumvent the firewall here and listen to that? Because I mean, he displays an incredible understanding of May 4th. And of course, he twists this in a way that it brings it all together, like, you know, Trump is on top of this. How do people see this? How does it resonate, Jian?
Well, I would say because it happened only 2 days ago, and I would say absolute majority of the Chinese people can't really, you know, circumvent the firewall. So it has a very small echoing among the Chinese, I would say, chamber. But for those people who could watch the, you know, his about 20 minutes, you know, in Chinese statement about, I mean, discussion on Wusi, I think most of those response from the Chinese side, it would be very, very sympathetic, positive, and say, yes, I would agree. And yes, Wusi should be, May the First Movement should be interpreted in that way. But again, I would say those are people who bother, you know, to circumvent the firewall are already self-selected. So we definitely could not really treat those people who actually could watch the statement of, you know, the speech of Pottinger as a good representation of the general Chinese population.
Yeah. Fellows, I still have lots of questions. It's fun discussing, but I turn over to Jacob because he's monitoring the questions from the audience. So maybe Jacob, you take over.
Sure. We'll start with a question from George Magnus. Great discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your views. Can you see any form of inquiry, and if so, what, into the COVID outbreak and management with lessons to be learned that Beijing would not rail against as humiliation? In my opinion, without one, dangerous speculation will not be put to rest.
Did you get that?
Very good question. Yeah.
But if it's a good question, Mikko, then go ahead.
You know, as I said earlier, I think at the current stage, it's quite unlikely. It will take time. If at all, it will be mediated through international institutions. So, you know, obviously you can't expect China to accept any EU investigators coming into the country and, you know, discussing independently without any oversight with doctors on the ground, etc. It's just unimaginable. So if at all, it would be mediated through the WHO in a pretty low-key process that we probably would value more than the Chinese. It seems to be unlikely because it is so loaded, and under the current situation in the next 6 months with all of this escalating in the public discourse on both sides. I don't see it, George. So good questions, but not really optimistic on it.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic either. I think although a very low profile WHO-led, say, cooperative investigation, that we Chinese also want to know who is the say, number 0 of the first man or woman who got the disease, for very, medically sound, reasons. We also want WTO to join us for a cooperated investigation of that. But I think even in that kind of very low profile, cooperative investigation, I think the Chinese government would set a lot of, say, taboos. Say, no research can even go towards the direction of, say, a lab release or lab outbreak. I mean, that, of course, I think until now, most of people agree that lab, accusation is still quite outlier thing, but still, you can't really, in a real investigation, to exclude that kind of thing, right? An investigation, if it want to get credibility, it must be thorough, or possible, scenarios has to be tapped. But I guess that the Chinese government would exclude that. And if they really do that, I would say the credibility of this WTO-led delegation coming to China in cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of Health would also be lost, right? So in that sense, I mean, what's the purpose? What's the significance of that kind of, say, investigation, right? There will be only a new round of questioning of WHO, and China is going to defend their cooperation with WHO. And that could be actually a perfect place to escalate, the current, say, division between Chinese government and many of those governments in the West about the origin of it. So I would say no, there's not going to be a very significant form of inquiry that would be credible. I don't think so.
Yeah. And if at all, it would be packaged, as you said, in a way that would also look at responsibilities of other governments in not preventing the spread, etc. So it would be a blame game already in the setup of the study itself.
Yeah. I just want to have a little commercial now. George Magnus was asking the question. He's going to be on the panel on the 15th of May. George was with UBS and one of the very few people who saw the great financial crisis unfolding in 2008 already. So he's the man with the crystal ball, and he will square up with Timothy Garton-Ash and Peter Mandelson, and this is going to be on the 15th of May. So Jacob, what's the next question?
Yep, the next question comes from Davide Cucino, our president emeritus. He says, today in a press conference by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy, there was a discussion about sort of the reliance on emergency support for medical PPE, but also a lot of economic dependency that Italy and several other European countries are having with China. And that on the other side, you have the relationship with the United States, both in terms of security guarantees and also the economic relationship. So how do these countries that are more or less tied to both China and the US for their economic and for their health or security sort of guarantees, how do they balance these relationships moving forward?
Davide was also chairman for the Italian Chamber for decades. So maybe I'll pick Jian first, being in Italy.
Okay, I think, because China is the #2 economy in the world, more and more, national economies are becoming, unprecedentedly closely tied with the fortune of the Chinese economy. And Italy happens to be one of the richer economies who have a very tight, very tight link with the Chinese economy. But I mean, if you have to face a strategic choice, my question is, of course, you have to really have some of its own, say, judgment about the long-term, economic prosperity of China. I am less optimistic than many of my international friends about the long-term economic prosperity of China. We already see, the growth rate has been in decline for 10 years, right? And we also see a lot of huge structural demographic challenges to the Chinese economy. So my answer to many of, not just any of those students, people who are interested in this, say, not look at the next, but look at the next 15 years at least. If you being in a leadership, that you play some role, either in population or as an leader, you should really make a bet on the long term. My opinion, the last, I would say, 3 years has been the Chinese power already peaked. We are already at the best moment. We are already at the highest point that we could be in the international already. In the near future, maybe starting from 5 years, we are going to see more and more China side and the Chinese of China will change fundamentally. Yeah.
Mikko, Jian is coming and going in the speech. Is that the same for you in Berlin?
It's the same, and I just saw Corinne Abel in the chat that it's also true for Beijing, obviously, and not only in your place. So it might be a structural issue.
Yeah. All right, Mikko, then you sound very crisp and clear. Let me throw something at you. Political casualties of the COVID crisis. What about 17+1? These Central European countries that have been carved out by Beijing, some of them with the European Union, some not, including Greece. It hasn't really succeeded as much as I think China, all these 17 currencies envisaged. Will that continue? And then, of course, the follow-up question also for Jian is Belt and Road, which is actually something the Chamber investigated in January and found that there's very little real business in there for the international companies. Is Belt and Road, given that many countries do not have the money anymore to pay back the kind of infrastructure China's offering, and even China might not have the money anymore in order to finance something in Venezuela, that rather puts the money into Guizhou. What do you think 17+1 and BRI, will they fade away? Mikko first.
Right, thank you. And, also happy to talk about the earlier things. And what I got from Jian really was that, his statement that China's power potentially has peaked already. I mean, this is obviously something that we should be discussing for 2 hours. But anyway, on the 17+1 more specifically, look, we shouldn't judge this from Berlin. So what we rely on here really is insights from the region, and we have quite some good access and expert analysis there. And they tell us that, it might seem to be fading. And yes, there's a lot of disappointment on the political level in some countries. And yes, there hasn't been, the big delivery of investment that everyone potentially was expecting wrongly from the outset. But still, this thing is life. It is happening. It has an impact on politics. It is changing the way how relevant politicians are looking at China. So it's not just an empty shell. There's some substance to it, which is simply, we have to align our expectations and understanding of that type of diplomatic outreach. It's not about formalized, institutionalized cooperation, but it's about shifting mindsets. It's about changing a long-term trajectory of how politicians and elites in these countries look at China. And with that, it's successful to some extent. So I don't think we should be betting on 17+1 to go away. On the contrary, I would expect some expansion and to some extent also doubling down of efforts. But at the same time, it will never deliver, or not in terms of our fears, but also not in terms of the hopes that some member states had on this. It's not going to go away. It is going to be not efficient, but it's going to be effective in its influence in the region. On Belt and Road, I let Jian talk, but as you said, CDB, Exim, the big banks behind it, they will have some work to do at home first. So structurally, it's not a good picture. But again, it's not going to go away. You will see outbound loans, investment in infrastructure development, focusing on digital, etc. So there's some things that will be still there. It might be downtoned, but I leave it to Jian to talk about it. He knows better.
Oh, I can't say that I know better about BRI. I think my voice is now better, right?
That's perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. The Wi-Fi of Italy is not as good as in China. I would say that. Maybe the infrastructure thing should start from here. But still, I think I saw somebody asking me to restate my findings. I still think that China is. I mean, when I was really young, I got impressed about a lot of talkings. I think still, people of certain age can still have a memory about a book called, The Rise and the Fall of Great Powers, by Paul Kennedy, published in 1987. And triggered a lot of a debate about the United States, the end of the Cold War era, overstretch of imperial power. And I would say, of course, I tend to look at BRI as one project that is now overstretching the Chinese force, Chinese energy, Chinese money. And although I do see some of the rationale behind the BRI infrastructure building, but I am afraid most of the money would end up like nowhere. It's just like, very famously in the United States, a bridge to nowhere or a road to nowhere. Many of those countries that the Chinese now are pouring money into simply lacked the political fundamentals for sustained economic growth. It's not just to say you get roads, you got ports, you get everything. That's not true. That's true in the case of Vietnam, maybe, but not really in many other countries. And sadly, unfortunately, a lot of countries in the Africa continent, right? They don't have the political infrastructure. What would be the use of the regular infrastructure, right? But okay, that's a judgment about the specific BRI projects across the world, but a BRI as an imperial expansion project, I think it's overstretching Chinese power, and inside the country, inside China, domestically, we also have a lot of very costly projects ongoing, not just infrastructure, but actually even the social welfare net of the Chinese population is becoming, I would say, thinner and sparser than before, right? So that's all I would call overstretch. I said, in my last, 5 minutes statement that China already peaked in terms of its prestige, in terms of its position in the international hierarchy, very much because the Chinese economy may have already peaked. Of course, this can only be verified or confirmed, say, 10 or 15 years from now. But I think the trajectory is really pessimistic, at least for me. And in that case, we are going to face a much more tired China in the future. But also a tired China could be even more, let's say, assertive, because international policy would be out for consumption for domestic purposes, right? So overall, I think whether China is still continue on the rise or is already started some kind of long decline or short decline, no matter what the picture would be, I think it's a relationship. China's relationship with the outside world would only become more troublesome in the foreseeable future. Yeah.
What a great picture, Jian. I think tired China, that captures a lot of the things that we're seeing here. So thank you for that. I think that's brilliant. Just before you go back to Jörg for his questions.
Perfect. All right, we have a question from Marazi. How do you read China's decision not to contribute funds to the EU-driven vaccine development initiative, which is supported as well by the World Health Organization? The US and Russia are out of it. Why do you think China didn't grab at this opportunity?
Because they don't see it as one. That's the problem here. It's not a process that they control. It's not a process where they would be in the lead in terms of the visibility. And it's a visibility contest here about global leadership. And quite honestly, it's also a question about domestic priorities versus international priorities. It's still not self-evident for a political leader in China to be selling to his domestic audience that they would be investing more abroad than investing at home. I think that's the reason. At the same time, despite all the preparedness of the diplomatic apparatus and the professionalization that Jian talked about earlier, it's just, the mindset behind it. This was a very fast-moving process, lots of diplomatic notes being sent back and forth between the European Union and other stakeholders. So you would have to be on your tiptoes really to be engaged in such a process. And then, China simply doesn't have a vision for that type of global leadership at the current stage. And they're not prepared for it to take up such an opportunity. I mean, look, what a symbol it would have been, China and the EU and many other countries and Russia and the US out, a clear win, an easy win for Beijing if they want to have it. But it's just a question of strategic outlook and mindset that I think is not in place.
Jian, taking up this China is tired, if you look into the Guinness Books of Records about parties in power, of course, the Soviets still take the cake with 74 years. China's Communist Party is in office now for 70 years. Would that sort of relate to the fact that you say a 70-year-old system with no governmental change in the system is simply tired?
No, I'm not really follow that line. I think actually, although yes, we got one political party ruling China for more than 70 years already now, but I see quite a lot of change in the last 70 years. Of course, Deng Xiaoping is a major change, and you can argue that President Xi Jinping is a big change of the Deng system already. So I see that even a one-party system could be capable of a significant change. China did that, but when I say China would be tired and even suffer fatigue, I mean mostly about its I would say population trend, its economic trend, and of course also very importantly a very I have to quote kind of or paraphrase a little bit of some of my favorite American scholars. China is coming to a close-mindedness. China is not as open-minded as 40 years ago. And actually, if you compare China now with, the May 4th movement, everybody talking about recently, China is a much more close-minded. That kind of close-minded is a good sign of fatigue, tiredness. And of course, you can see that's arrogance or whatsoever. But I say, both spiritually, mentally, and economically, and demographically, is going to be China is a tired system. And of course, shall I just add one thing? If we have, say, President Xi Jinping behind the helm for another, say, 7, 8, or even 15 years, we see also the tiredness of the very leadership in person. Let's remember, early 1980s, what happened in Soviet Union. You got Chernenko, you got Brezhnev, you got Andropov, right? 3 very octogenarian leaders. That's also a kind of tiredness. I think when I referring, say, China as a tired, say, great power, starting from the near future, I think it has a multifold significance over there.
Yeah. I've actually got my own kind of follow-up question to the last one about vaccines. What do you think happens if different countries under different leaderships win the race to a COVID vaccine? I think it it's an interesting kind of thought experiment of what happens if the United States under Trump versus under Biden finds the vaccine first. What happens if a European country gets it first? What happens if China gets it first? So looking at it from kind of an international political perspective, how do you see these different countries or different leaders trying to use it as a diplomatic tool or even a weapon?
So this is a question to me?
To anyone.
You want to pick it up? All yours.
Okay, I mean, in a spirit of just a roundtable discussion, I would say Trump and China would use the vaccine as a political tool. I don't see it's in London or in, say, in European Union. And of course, a specific politician would not lose the opportunity to get some, gain some political capital. Say, you know, the research that we sponsored at Oxford or somewhere, great. I mean, Boris Johnson would not lose it. But compared that with the investment on a vaccine that Trump and say the Chinese government has done, I think you know, European is relatively apolitical on the vaccine issue, while China and the United States are very politicized. And part of the reason that China would not join EU-led efforts to develop a vaccine, I think partly comes from this. But because China, I think the Chinese government is somehow confident that because we were the first to get the virus, we started early, there's a good hope that we can be the first to get some effective vaccine. So they don't want to lose the championship or share the championship with some of the Europeans. Why, right? Yeah.
Fully agree. I think that makes sense.
All right. Jumping to the next question from one of our members, Peter Ling Veneris. What do you think the consequences will be for European business in China once Europe chooses sides, as per your outlined trajectories?
Right. I mean, that's $1 million question, or probably $1 billion question.
But it means, do we have to close the chamber or not?
No. You just have to repatriate to China. No. Seriously, I think we will have to look at this on different layers. So first of all, what we will see is companies needing, and that's already happening on a day-to-day basis, needing to look at supply chains much more closely than in the past for at least 3 reasons. One, you know, political risk in China or any type of risk in China. Second, pressure from the US on certain types of technologies. And then third, also that European debate about, you know, reshoring some core supply chains on batteries, etc. Now looking at the personal protective equipment, so anything related to health issues, etc. So on all of these layers, we will see step by step a more complicated situation. That's the first, I think, that we can anticipate already today. And then in terms of business strategies, again, you know much better than I and Jörg, for sure, is that economic trajectory, obviously, that is so essential. Is a tired China the place to be? Yes, because of the size, and even if it's sleeping, it's relevant. But you know, the China plus one narrative, the China plus how many narrative, all of this will increase in relevance. But more specifically, you know, European business will have to position itself with regard to how they lobby at home domestically for certain policies. So because they will have to be involved in that strategic debate about the European China policy, much more than just advocating for market access and openness in China. And that's certainly also a new reality. It's going to be much more political than in the past, and about the strategic issues, and not only market access and other things related to that.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what just said by Mikko. I got one thing to add. That is, if the European EU has to choose a side and chose the US side in the coming big game, if you will, I think the European business in China, of course, would become more difficult. But I think there's a new potential that some of the European business would be used by the Chinese government as kind of link to, as kind of say, I would say kingmaker role. That the Chinese government would play kingmaker. Say they're going to intentionally release some room of profitability for certain European firms, not just out of a business reason, but for political reason. For example, they want to utilize Volkswagen, let's use it as an example, say as a big force for pro-China voice, for China voice in Europe society. So they're going to say, give even more room to Volkswagen or other similar size, similar prestigious companies of European origin. And also sometimes they may be, say, pick some of the smaller ones, let's say Fiat, because Italy is already fairly pro-China, so they want to use that, business. So business of European countries would be fully politicized by the Chinese strategic choice. I think that's what I would say would becoming a new likelihood in the future. After all, we see already, the most pro-China voices in Washington has always been, Caterpillar has always been, Boeing civilian, the civilian part of Boeing, right? So that the same strategy would be also deployed among those selected European business. That would be my prediction. Yeah.
Perfect. Very good. Our next question comes from Andreas Hube. Dear gentlemen, thank you for the good discussion. As it seems, the EU-China summit originally scheduled for September in Leipzig will be canceled for 2020 and also not be replaced by a virtual meeting. If this is the case, what is your opinion? Is this a missed opportunity for EU-China relations or a good excuse for Europe and Germany, Europe/Germany, not to have to face the challenges in public at this point in time? Thanks and all the best.
I have a different set of information, and probably that's speculation to some extent, but my understanding is, that the Leipzig summit, which is not the EU-China summit, just to be a bit more specific, will take place, or at least there's the intention for it to take place, and probably in a virtual setting. That's my current state of affairs. Again, we have probably EU embassies on the call here, and they might know better. So my expectation is that the ambition on both sides is to hold it. But I still agree with you that the new setup and the circumstances, to some extent, give actors in Europe a way out here, because the ambition set for this Leipzig summit was too high, quite frankly. Concluding that investment agreement, I've been pretty outspoken about the likelihood of that very early on, about a year ago, and I continue to think that it's incredibly unlikely, despite just recent progress again. So you might see an agreement on ISDS, for instance, on investor-state dispute settlement that is somewhat locked in and then packaged as not an agreement, but something that they can hold on. There will be an agreed narrative about the political will to conclude this, or maybe even political agreement in that space that will somewhat mask the situation that we haven't actually achieved the specifics of a full-fledged investment agreement. In practice, on market access, on SOE disciplines, we're still worlds apart. That is my reading, at least. Some progress on sustainability, ISDS, etc. But that does make an agreement. So yes, it gives leadership on both sides a bit of a way out, in the sense that they can now talk about how effective they can cooperate on COVID, which, quite honestly, is probably also the bigger priority. It's hard to digest, but politically, and if you look at the global situation, and from a human perspective, I think there's good reasons to talk about these issues. The danger is obviously that, you know, this turns into a public diplomacy stunt where everyone's saying, you know, it's so beautiful to cooperate, but in practice, nothing is actually happening. And that would be really the worst outcome.
Perfect. And we have from Andreas Fige, kind of adding to the previous question, are there any chances to enter into the EU-China investment treaty, the CAI, in the near future or perhaps further in the future, you know, after the coronavirus has sort of subsided, as a way for China to try to give those, to give that market access that Dr. Zhang was just discussing, to kind of cement the European business community back towards a more pro-engagement camp?
I'll leave that to Jian, but just one sentence. It is, there will be never something that is granted to Europe for political reasons. I mean, beyond what Jian just said, individual company access, etc. But a full-fledged agreement we will not get for political reasons, and only if it's aligned with the economic reform trajectory in China and SOE reforms and, you know, market access in certain sectors that they want to do anyway. So I don't fully share the premises of the questions basically, but I leave it to Jian to respond to that.
Oh, come on. You know, I'm not an expert about, say, investment or business the relations between between EU and China, but I do think I share the opinion of Mikko that such a treaty in the near future is a very, very low likelihood thing. It's simply very difficult for their side to really stop, you know, a half. You know, it's half cooked. You know, you can sign an investment treaty, but what about the necessary, I would say, a structural reform of the Chinese economy? You know, I think without that done in the first place, just a half-cooked or partial deal want to go quite far away. That would be my short answer. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to the investment agreement, let me just add some little bit more on the inside. There is 8 years, 28 on 29 rounds. It feels like the long march, frankly. I guess we are now facing a deadline that at least Angela Merkel and Macron see, that 13th of September in Leipzig, this 27 European leaders plus European Commission meeting, possibly President Xi Jinping, is a great occasion in order to get there. My experience over the last, 10 months is that there was no appetite in Beijing really until, I would say, 2 months ago, to really maneuver and get there. Maybe a lack of attention because of the US-China trade war. I think that has really sucked the oxygen out of the room. Or there was no feeling that, you know, Europe deserves the attention that we think it deserves. But I see a definite change over the last 8 weeks. We had a phone call, Ursula von der Leyen with Prime Minister Li Keqiang. We had Mr. China and the Commission, Mr. Dombrovskis, talking to Vice Premier Liu He. I understand that the working group, DG Trade as well as MOFCOM, makes progress. So there is a new earnest attempt in order to get this going. But again, if you have been doing business in China, you know the last 5 minutes are always the worst, because that's where you really have to compromise. And the compromise, of course, on the Chinese side would be in order to look into these state-owned enterprises. And that is politically very difficult. So hope is still there. I know that the Commission, DG Trade and everything is really, really pushing and trying hard. We're trying to flank it from the chamber by saying how important it is. But as we also said last year, we rather would like to have no deal than a bad deal.
Yeah. All right. We currently don't have any other questions from the audience, but if you do, please make sure to write them into the Q&A. We still have another 15 minutes. In the meantime, I'll ask one of my own questions. Can we expect any changes to whistleblower protections after Dr. Li and his colleagues were quite publicly seen as mistreated And will those protections actually produce the intended results?
Jian, that's for you. That's pure politics.
Well, maybe I'm a too pessimistic person in the recent several years. I'm becoming more pessimistic about a lot of issues. I don't think there is even such a concept of whistleblower among the within the Chinese government. So there's no even the starting point for us to talk about improve the whistleblower protection. I mean, of course, in many of the Western countries, we got that kind of, for example, United States, we got a little bit, I'm a little bit more familiar with that. So you got a Whistleblower Protection Act, and that's, that's well, defined what a whistleblower is and things like this, anonymization. In China, we are not even getting this, getting the start line. So I don't think it's going to happen. Of course, but on the other hand, I think it's very, very much futile to only call for, say, much more freedom of speech and things. I think that's really too far away. And so in general, I don't. There will be new legal now. I mean, remember, with all my due respect to Dr. Li, he did not intended to be a whistleblower. He didn't. He's brave, he's a good person, no problem. And I have a huge sympathy for him. But he didn't want to say, be a whistleblower. He's not, he's sharing some insider information only with his, his classmates, right? Again, with due respect to Dr. He's not a strictly defined whistleblower as we are going to say, a lower or middle ranking bureaucrat somewhere find his boss did something bad, then he reported it to the legislature or the court or even bigger boss. Even now, it's not that kind of whistleblower. He's great, but he's not that. So in that sense, I don't think there would be better, say, a protection of whistleblower. We don't have this kind of a definition in the first place. Yeah.
I think that's so right. I mean, you have a functional equivalent to a whistleblower in the Chinese system, which is the investigation teams being sent to places where they have a problem. I think that's probably quite unlikely that we see a fundamental change in that.
Let me take you in the last 15 minutes to a topic that has to do, of course, with Hong Kong and Taiwan. The great achievement of Deng Xiaoping was, of course, to unite the motherland and to bring Hong Kong and Macau back to the fold. And of course, that was supposed to be sort of the guiding light in order to eventually unite again with Taiwan. If you look into the development over the last years, this administration has possibly achieved that this goal is going to be as far as it has ever been. Might this be sort of come with political headwinds for this administration to say, you really ruined the kind of unification with Taiwan, you actually drove away Hong Kong? Or is this just naughty children in Hong Kong and, renegade people in Taiwan so they don't care over here? Does the kind of shift in Taiwan and Hong Kong resonate in political circles in Beijing?
Michael.
Well, let me start with an observation. I mean, I find it just so remarkable how much, we've seen a shift between an understanding of dual loyalties as something that is conducive to CCP interests in Beijing and tolerance for that in the periphery, Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and as something that, creates stability, and this shift now towards a system where dual loyalty is a liability and a problem, and needs to be fought, basically. And this is a historic change, I think, and is this probably, so essential for the future of China that we should be totally interested in getting a better understanding. My perspective on Hong Kong and Taiwan is that, just based on what we've seen over the past weeks again, we have to expect a deterioration of that situation. We see a more systematic clampdown on protesting patterns. We see a preparation to make sure that elections that will be happening later in Hong Kong, will not have an outcome that Beijing can't tolerate. So anticipating that political backlash, obviously. And on the ground, one expectation was by some observers that with Xi Jinping changing his team on the ground, he might have a better understanding and overview of the challenges. But in practice, it seems to be the case that maybe that's true, but that leads actually the leadership to a even more enforced clampdown on political forces there. So the Hong Kong trajectory is indeed something that I think is quite worrying. On Taiwan, they've maneuvered themselves in a situation that is, basically non-resolvable. As you said, Jörg, we've never seen a more powerful anti-China policy set up in Taiwan probably over the past decades. And combine this with the US-China conflict, and you sorry to bring out really the most pessimist things in me today, but I don't know how you do that. It's something that is quite challenging, but I don't think that you've seen hawks just over the past days, right? Taiwan hawks, public figures that have been used also to signal policy, pushing back against the idea that the leadership should be doing something on Taiwan in the next 2-3 years. So that's quite a signal, right? Even the hawks are fearful that something might be happening these days. But again, I'm moving in a space where Jian knows more, so I should leave you talk.
No, you're too modest. I would say, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang is too big. I really actually want to bring, everybody's attention to the roundup of about 15, pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong. I think 2 weeks from now, right? 2 weeks before. I mean, that's actually a very significant measure. I would say the SAR government did that thing, in a very smart timing, right? During the COVID-19, so they don't need to worry about the demonstrations on the streets about this. But what if, when this is, this kind of lockdown, ended, has to end. Shall we say more people demonstrate on the street for this kind of run-up? And although those people are now out of the detainment, but there will be, legal procedures. So, I mean, judging from that run-up of, 15, 14 leaders, I would say I'm afraid that the strategy of the central government of China is to escalate their pressure or crack down on Hong Kong, because last summer it's really a huge humiliation, for the central government, and now they are finding some. They are seeking some redress of that. So I'm even more pessimistic maybe about the situation in Hong Kong, because I mean, in case of Taiwan, although everybody is talking about confrontation, but I still see a war reasonably far off the horizon. While in Hong Kong, if the confrontation goes on, if say out of the lockdown, the young men and women there in Hong Kong, occupy the street again, and what will happen? I would say, the use of force, police force, paramilitary force on the Hong Kong island would escalate. So we are going to see maybe some physical, hurt on human body, right? Let me use that kind of language. So I'm even more pessimistic in that scenario. Yeah.
Well, Jian, there is a Russian proverb that says a optimist is a badly informed pessimist. So I'm sure you're very well informed. Let me come to the last question for you guys. The political significance of Olympia, the Winter Olympics 2022, around about 2 years from now. China really put all the efforts into the 2008 Olympics. Now they basically shine and sparkle already for 2022. Doesn't that event give the US and others leverage by threatening not to show up? I mean, the Moscow 1980 situation. And doesn't that sort of at least take some options away from the toolbox of China to do a couple of things because they really want to have a peaceful, well-attended show going on? So what is your take from here until the Olympics, how this is going to shape up?
Right, I'll start. You know, I think you're absolutely right that this will be obviously an occasion for celebration, propaganda, and obviously it will be very closely related to also the anniversary completed in 2021, etc. So it is planned to be a big show, and it has to be a big show. Now again, in terms of priorities, I think under the given situation, my assessment would be that the leadership in Beijing would be willing to tolerate the US not participating in this because it would reinforce some of their narratives about the global situation. You know, and if that in such a situation everyone else would participate, I mean, it would be actually helpful for them. So, you know, yes, I subscribe to some extent to your logic that, you know, they will be careful, but they will be careful in general. So more specifically on US participation, maybe that's just an opportunity to exactly show how the world looks like and that everyone is with China and the US is not playing along. Obviously, the US will put pressure on many other countries to not participate, but let's see where we land. It's been a difficult game back in the times when you had Moscow cancelled, and it's a really difficult political international game to make sure that no one is going there. So I'm skeptical whether the US would be willing and capable of actually achieving that specific goal, and by that also increase the pressure on Beijing in a way that would make them change their mind on structural issues.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays, I think too many things could happen within 2 years, right? So it's very difficult for us to say with great certainty about 2022. I mean, but if there is a 1980-like scenario, I mean, you need the situation go much, much worse than it is now, right? And maybe a possible war over the Taiwan Strait, that would become a good excuse or good reason for United States or even some of the European countries to really boycott that. But I don't know. I mean, 2 years, I think, scholars, researchers in think tank, in universities, in the governments, especially for those people whose research has something to do with politics, is in an unprecedented, horrible situation, because whatever we see could be proved wrong, tomorrow. So I think it's very difficult to see the 2022 over there. But I agree with Mikko that if United States, do not show up, that would not be something very, very bad for China. China can say, you see, the United States is not a participant, it's just a spectator of all the good things we're doing. So, it could be converted into some kind of a political capital for the Chinese leadership, especially for domestic consumption. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Jian, and thank you, Mikko, for contributing and being so nice in order to kickstart our birthday party. I also wanted to say that the next show is actually, I think, on Friday afternoon, Beijing time. We have the sitting EU Trade Commissioner, Phil Hogan, addressing us, and we have him framed by Jacob Wellenberg, who is the CEO of Investor AB, and also, of course, on the board of ABB and Ericsson. He's a Swedish heavyweight and a wonderful European. And then, of course, the Austrian Markus Breyer, who is the Director General of Business Europe, will chip in with his view on Brussels. So let me thank you all, in particular also the audience, for having great questions and the patience you have displayed. And at the end, I would just like to say that we had some Italian opposition about Jian's statement that the internet in Italy is worse than in China. So maybe you watch over your shoulder the next days. Thank you very much.